All right, thank you so much, Brittany. It looks like I might be using the podium mic instead of the lapel mic because that awesome introduction was me flipping the switch on the lapel mic. And apparently that was just how you introduce yourself here, that you build a thunderous lead up to everything. So I'll just stay here so we don't have to worry about the tech anymore. But forgive me if that gets a little bit awkward. I'm used to moving around, so I'll try not to move away from the mic. I'm really excited to be here with all of you here in Utah. I actually got my start as a healthcare professional here in the state of Utah 23 years ago. So I feel like I've kind of come full circle. I'm from Boise, Idaho, and I had a scholarship to the University of Utah, and I was originally intending on becoming a reconstructive plastic surgeon because I had a next door neighbor who did that, and I used to like to go look at his gore slides and figure out how he rearranged faces and made people look normal again. And it seemed like an artistic and sciencey and kind of fun thing to do. So I was excited to come down to the University of Utah. And some of you are probably cheering about that. Some of you are probably reaching deep to find some forgiveness about that. Some of you probably don't care, but it's really good to be with you. When I get back from an opportunity with the Alabama Long-Term Care Association next month, I will have had the blessing of presenting to groups in 37 of the 50 states in the last few years. And it's a privilege to be here in Utah because this is the first time I've spoken to the Utah Healthcare Association, and I've thought many times, wow, this is strange. I'm talking to groups all over the place, and the one group that I haven't talked to is the place where all of this journey began. So I'm really grateful to have the privilege of being here. I spent 9 years working with a company in Salt Lake after I graduated from college. I ended up not becoming a doctor, and I got a degree in interpersonal and group communication, minor in psychology, and I had also studied classical piano and saxophone performance. And so I actually started out as a program director at a large assisted living facility in the Holiday area. And after a few years, I became the executive director of that facility and spent 9 years with that company. Went up to Boise and took over a memory care community there, ran that for 7 years. And then 7 years ago, I started A Mind for All Seasons. So that's just a little bit about my journey. Now, some of you might be looking at the title of this presentation, 3 Keys to Retaining a Vibrant and Engaged Workforce. And some of you are probably thinking, I just like any workforce. Like, give me some warm bodies. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Yes. This is a difficult situation that we're in. And I hope that you'll come out of our time today with some key takeaways. And I don't have any idea what they're going to be. I know some of the points that I'm going to try to make and some of the insights that I'm going to try to share that I think will be helpful. But I don't know what the most important thing is that you might get out of this. I hope that you'll control the second conversation going on in your head enough that you can recognize this key insight that might come out of today's presentation. When I talk about the second conversation, every public speaker, every teacher, everyone that interacts with others on some level is aware that there are 2 conversations going on in everyone's head. Right now, you have the conversation going on that's obvious. You're processing the words that I'm saying. You're thinking about what's coming in your ears. You're making sense of that. You're trying to connect it to your prior knowledge. But there's also another conversation. Now, sometimes that other conversation is, wow, how could I apply this in my building or with my team? And sometimes the other conversation is, I can't believe that my wife and I had that conversation at 6:30 this morning. That was terrible. That was not good. By the way, that I had a good conversation with my wife. I'm not sharing anything personal here, but sometimes we're thinking about what we're going to do after the conference is over. Sometimes we might be worried about some peripheral thing, and that's really what's going on in the second conversation. It doesn't take any of us very long to process the words that are coming in our ears. So there's a lot of mental white space that sometimes gets filled with pretty distracting things. And before long, you look up and you realize, wait a minute, I don't remember the last 5 minutes of what that guy said. Maybe there was something important there. So I invite you right now to just do your very best to set aside that second conversation and leave it for really processing and thinking about what you're hearing, and trying to connect it to the situations that you're finding yourself in, and looking for those insights. If you can find one thing that you will do differently immediately as a result of your time here today, then our time will have been well spent. Fair enough? You willing to do that? Okay, I see a few nodding heads. Hopefully there are a bunch of other internal nodding heads. All right. I don't know where you were in January of 2020, but I had just a few months earlier leased new office space. We had built out what we call a brain therapy studio. We were doing a lot of innovative applied science and research to help people with all sorts of brain-related disorders. We needed bigger space. We needed an opportunity to help a lot more people. And so I was really excited when January 2020 rolled around, that we had the space set up, we had decorated it, everything was really moving forward. And I thought, wow, this is going to be the year of perfect vision. 2020 vision, I can see clearly how much this company is going to grow and the impact that we're going to make in a lot of people's lives. And I was truly excited about that. And somehow I missed the fact that there was an overpass that read changes ahead. I drove under it, not even aware that things right around the corner were going to make my world fall to pieces. By the time the pandemic hit, I lost 3/4 of the revenue of my company overnight. Just shut down. Part of that is because we were doing a lot of work with assisted living and skilled nursing facilities and their residents, and we couldn't even go into those buildings, let alone them come to our office to receive some of the treatments that we were doing there. That was devastatingly difficult. But I sat in my office by myself because the rest of my team was working remotely, and day after day I stared out the window. And I was really tempted to just fold up for the day because right in back of my office is a golf course. And it was really tempting to think, well, at least I'd be outside and I could just go out and play some golf. But instead I sat there trying to wrap my head around the situation that I was facing. How was I going to keep people working? How was I going to keep the company going? Now, I realized that you had some really devastating things occur as a result of the global pandemic. Your world changed, and then it changed, and then it changed again. And that only got you to noon one day, right? Because regulations were coming out, and it was different from day to day. And it was really hard. It still is really hard for healthcare professionals. I think most of the world doesn't realize how challenging skilled nursing and assisted living still is in a lot of parts of the country. So I sat there staring out the window, and I asked an important question. I think one of the keys to overcoming difficult challenges in our lives is learning to ask better questions. And so I asked the question, what would have to be true for me to say that the COVID pandemic was the very best thing that happened to A Mind for All Seasons? And it took me a couple of days of hard thought and staring out the window. But I finally had an impression come. There was an idea that popped into my head that simply said, cast your net on the other side of the boat. Now, some of you might recognize that idea. It's actually a biblical idea. But that idea of casting your net on the other side of the boat meant something to me. What it meant to me is that all of the pivots that we had thought about making as a team down the road were things that we needed to make sooner. And by making them sooner, it actually put us in a way better place than I could ever have imagined. Now, this is not about my journey, this is about your journey. So I'm not going to go into the details of all the good that has come from making those pivots. But I bet some people are just waiting for things to go back the way that they were. Some people are just waiting to be able to have plentiful crops of people to hire and all sorts of ways to go back to maybe what they experienced a decade ago if you've been a healthcare professional for that long. And I got news for you, it's not going to happen. We can't live life in the rearview mirror, we're not going back there. But if you were to ask yourself, how do I take this moment of opportunity and just run with it? How could the situation that I'm in open up a whole bunch of new possibilities? I promise you they're out there. Most of the companies that are on the S&P 500 were actually created in periods of major economic upheaval. Because when the pendulum of life swings, it creates this vacuum that opens up a space for opportunity and innovation. I hope after the end of our time, you'll recognize that some of the problems that we're dealing with now were not created by the COVID pandemic. Many of the problems, I would dare say most of the problems that you and I are facing right now were created very slowly over a long period of time. And part of what we're dealing with as healthcare professionals is that we have not been innovative enough for so long that there are a whole lot of things now that we have to deal with. And the pandemic just exposed the flaws in the system to a degree, which means there has never been a greater moment of opportunity for healthcare professionals ever in the history of the modern world. This is an exciting time. Hopefully, more of us will feel that excitement by the end of this. Now, when there are challenges, when we pass under that freeway sign that says change is ahead and we don't recognize it, and suddenly we wake up one day and we realize, man, my world is upside down. When things are hard, what do we do as human beings? Well, we tend to look outward and we tend to try to figure out who can we blame? Who's responsible for this? We tend to blame the pandemic for a lot of things right now, but it's true in other aspects of our lives. I remember many years ago when I was still working in Salt Lake City and some new buildings started opening. And I was in a building that was new. I actually started working in that building the week of the 1-year anniversary. So it was a newer building, but by the time I'd been there for several years, there were other newer kids on the block. And they came in and they had all sorts of bells and whistles. And I remember one of our marketing directors saying, how are we supposed to compete with this place down the street? I mean, have you seen their facility? It's all shined up. They've got all the bells and whistles. And all it takes is 6 months of jazzy chairs driving around, and the building looks like it's 20 years old, right? They run into everything. They scar it all up. It looks like a disaster. And how are we going to compete with that? Or how are we supposed to compete with facility XYZ? They have radio ads. Or they have television ads. Or have you seen the size of their marketing budget? Or have you heard about that? We tend to look outward. We tend to think about staffing problems, for example, and we say things like, oh my gosh, there are 100 jobs advertised in the local market for everything from CNAs to administrators to nurses to dietary directors, whatever it is. There's 100 jobs advertised, and there's only about 20 people out there looking. How are we supposed to deal with that? I mean, we've got a labor shortage. How can we find enough people? You see how that type of talk is looking outward and it's blaming other people and things that are external to our control. Well, I got news for you. You and I can choose to be 100% responsible for everything that happens in our lives. And when we take full responsibility and we start working on solutions instead of figuring out how to blame, that's when magic starts to happen. And that's a tough reality to deal with. Some people might be thinking, well, gosh, what if the power goes out? That's not my fault. I don't control the power company. You're right. The first time the power goes out, it's not your fault. But if power is critically important to your business operations, if you absolutely have to have some electricity, then it's your fault if you don't get a generator and make sure that it's in good working order so that when the power does go out, you've taken care of it. A lot of us go through life as a thermometer instead of a thermostat. Maybe you've heard that idea before. A thermometer takes the temperature of the world around it, and a thermostat sets the temperature. I think a lot of us go through the day just sort of checking in on the temperature of the world, trying to figure out what fires there are to put out, trying to figure out whether things are hot or cold, so to speak, and not enough of us take full responsibility for setting the thermostat and saying, regardless of what's going on, here's my temperature. Here's what I'm going to bring to the world. So I invite you to consider that. Am I a thermostat or am I a thermometer? Now, when it comes to the effects of the pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people think that what we're suffering from right now was caused by the global pandemic. And I promise you I'm not going to spend the entire time talking about the pandemic because you've heard it all and people have talked about the pandemic the last few years. The point is that people blame the pandemic for so much, and I want to try to prove to you that it's not responsible for our situation. So consider a 2018 research study by the ADP Research Institute. This ADP Research Institute study proved the same thing that a 2015 study had shown. And this was across many different countries. The 2018 study was in 19 countries, almost 20,000 people across a broad range of industries. So consider the following. They found that 84% of workers were unengaged. Now that was long before the pandemic hit. 84% of workers unengaged. I think that alone is proof that as far as workforce challenges, the pandemic didn't cause them. The pandemic exposed them. So instead of looking to external forces, we need to pay attention to the internal things that have been going on for a long time. I think it's a win that our problems were created by internal problems because that means that none of us are victims and we can do something about it. We can actually change our situation for the good. What happened with the pandemic, I think, is summed up very well by something that Warren Buffett said. He once said that when the tide goes out, you get to see who's been swimming naked. There are a whole lot of people who got caught with their pants down when the tide went out. And we can do something about that. Just because we've taken 100 steps down the wrong road doesn't mean we need to take the 101st. So what do we have to do? What does it mean to focus on internal kinds of challenges? Well, one of the things that we need to understand is how we got to this point. And I think an analogy for how things have gotten so tenuous as healthcare professionals is that we tried to load new software on old hardware. I don't know if you've ever tried to do that. My wife has an old iPad that should be really functional. It should work well, but now she can't upgrade it. I don't even remember what version of iOS the thing topped out at, but every time she's tried to upgrade it after that, the iPad says, can't do it. And so now, one by one, her apps have stopped working. And just the other day, she said, honey, I have to get a new iPad. This thing won't hardly work at all. I can barely check emails on this thing if I want to. As hardware ages out, you run out of space. Things don't keep up with the current software. And part of what has happened to us in the world is not just affecting healthcare, it's affecting the entire workplace. We have grown up in a workplace that knows about leading people because the old military-industrial complex, top-down, heavy-handed, command and control, leftovers from World War II. People learn how to influence other people by watching other people who are in positions of leadership. And for our lifetime, the people who were calling the shots are people that learned from the military leaders of the past. And the world is radically different than it was then. For one thing, if you go back to the 1940s and 50s, there were not very many women in the workplace. Now there are a lot of women in the workplace. That alone changes the dynamic, and it gives us a lot more perspective to be dealing with. I think that that's a valuable thing. I think we've been blessed by having a diversity of perspectives, but it's changed things. In most areas, the workforce is also much more ethnically diverse than it has ever been. And in some places, there are as many as 4 generations in the workforce at the same time. And you all know that there are differences between the younger crowd and the older crowd. And those differences have always existed. If you go back to 1920, you'll find newspaper articles complaining about the irresponsibility of the younger generation and how they just don't care enough and they're just not engaged enough. And really what we see in those newspaper articles is evidence that we go through different phases in life and we learn different things, and there is such a thing as gaining experience and maturity as we get older. Those things have always existed. But as we look at the workforce of today, it is so dramatically different that the strategies and techniques and tools of the past simply don't work. Now, when you consider how fast information flows nowadays, that's even more staggering, I think, than the changes in the workforce. It's not just that we've got a bunch of ethnic minorities and both men and women in the workplace, and that there are all these differences of opinion. It's that the ideas flow at literally the speed of light. And when all of the leadership strategies and techniques that most people turn to were developed, you couldn't even easily pick up the phone and talk to someone in England, much less FaceTime them or have a Zoom meeting with someone. I have some people that I communicate with regularly overseas in my business. And it's amazing to me how easy it is in the modern world to do that. So by the time we develop a plan for dealing with something, let's say we're putting together a marketing plan. By the time we put together a marketing plan, it really tells you where we've recently been. It's not very good about where we're going because the whole world is shifting and changing so doggone fast that the plan that we put together doesn't really help us anymore. We've got to be able to change things at the speed of light and turn on a dime and have very nimble organizations. And so if we're trying to do things in the old way, it just doesn't work anymore. And we get into trouble and we have a lot of disengagement in the workforce. So what really drives things like occupancy? What really drives staff retention? One of the problems that we've seen in the last several years, and it's gone on a lot longer than the pandemic, is that many people have left long-term care. Why is that? What's going on? What have we failed to do? Again, many people look to their occupancy problem through the lens of external issues. Oh, they've got that new facility down the street with all the bells and whistles, we can't possibly compete. Many people look to the workforce problems and blame external circumstances. But it's actually internal stuff. I think that it's customer experience that's the real driver of these kinds of things. I mean, let's face it, there are businesses out there that never have to advertise for employees. People will line up and would give their eye teeth to be able to work at certain companies. They want to have a job at some of those companies. They would kill for it. And so those companies get to pick the cream of the crop. But we haven't done enough as healthcare professionals for many, many years to create the conditions that would be highly attractive to people. I've often found it interesting that many young people are so excited about serving others and finding opportunities to get outside themselves that they will quit school for a period of time, and whether for a church mission or some humanitarian mission or all sorts of other opportunities, they will go overseas at their own expense for anywhere from a month to years to do good in the world and to make a difference. And yet we can't attract people to stay closer to home where there are lots of opportunities to make a difference in others' lives, and we'll even pay them a little bit to do that. That's a curious thing for me. If people are willing to go abroad and give of themselves so that they can have that experience early on in their life before they get into the real meat and potatoes of their career, then why can't we attract them to helping professions in much higher numbers? Well, I think it must be because we haven't created a significant enough of an opportunity and communicated it to them. We haven't created enough of an experience that would make them want to show up and participate in what we're doing so that they can have those experiences serving other people. We can do more. And it's going to take all of our best ideas to figure that out. Now, one of the things that I would point out, sorry, this clicker's a little goofy sometimes. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. One of the things that I would point out is that the reason that we tend to focus on outward things instead of looking inward, we focus on external circumstances instead of customer experience and other internal things, because hunting is a lot sexier than farming. It's fun to go out, and I'm not a hunter, I'll admit, but it's kind of fun to go out and have the thrill of the kill, so to speak. If you've got an occupancy problem or if you've got a staffing problem, it's exciting to go out and recruit and have someone say, I think I'm interested in what you have to say. I think I want to have more of what you have to offer. That gives us a little bit of a dopamine hit, doesn't it? It feels good. It's kind of like going out and looking for the big buck that you're going to take down and mount and put on your wall to prove to the world that you're a mighty hunter. But hunting cannot sustain a large population. You just can't do it. The only way to sustain a large population is through farming. And farming is decidedly less sexy than hunting. I mean, think about it. Before you can even plant the seed, you got to do a whole lot of prep work and clear the ground and amend the soil and make sure that it's ready. And then you got to put the seed in, and then you got to wait for it and keep watering it and keep weeding around it and hope that it grows. And then that little shoot comes up and you nurture it and it grows and it takes time. And even when the plant is quite large, you can have a tomato plant that's really big and have no fruit on it. And it doesn't matter how big the plant gets. If it doesn't fruit, then what's it all for? And when it comes to our organizations, the things that really make them amazing, the things that would attract people to want to actually interact with us, the things that would cause families to stand up and say, wow, I want to move my loved one there because they have some things that I can't get anywhere else. Well, that takes a whole lot of farming. That takes time. That takes hard work. That takes commitment over the long haul. That is painful. I think I'll just go out and go hunting instead. And so there are a lot of organizations that do a really good job trying to bring staff and residents through the front door, and meanwhile they're just falling right back out the back door for one reason or another. Once we understand that farming is really where it's at, if we want to support a large population, then we can continue pushing our way through the painful experience of really needing to focus on internal problems. So I want to tell you a true story about how powerful this can be. In 2009, I was sitting in Salt Lake in the assisted living facility where I was working as the executive director, and we had won a bunch of awards. Things were going well. We were sitting at 98% occupancy. We had a steady stream of leads that were coming in. I was feeling pretty good about things, and a recruiter called out of the blue. And normally I didn't pay a lot of attention to recruiting calls. They came from time to time, as they probably do for you too. But this one caught my attention because the recruiter was looking for someone to come to Boise, Idaho. That's where I grew up, and that's where most of my family was still living. And I thought, well, that's great. My kids would be close to their grandparents. And it was to run a memory care community, exclusively memory care. And by this point in my career, I had spent a lot of time studying Alzheimer's and related types of dementia. And I'd been interested in Alzheimer's since I wrote a paper on it in high school. So this was an opportunity to have a little lab to experiment in, and I was really excited for that opportunity. Well, one thing led to another, and my wife and I ended up moving our family up to Boise, Idaho. And I knew that this memory care community was struggling. They were at 72% occupancy, And I knew that the administrator that had opened that building had been with them for 4 years, and things were highly successful for the first 4 years. And then for about 3 years, things fell apart. The initial administrator retired, and they went through 5 different directors of that facility in 3 years. And I don't even have to fill in the details there. You can guess the kinds of things that were probably going on in that building. But I knew that I was coming into sort of a turn it around type of a position. And I was excited for that until I got to Friday of the first week. Now, one of the things that the recruiter and the owners of this company let me know is that I was going to be responsible for all the external marketing as well as running the facility. The idea was scale back your administrative load, because I was running a building with 120 apartments, and I was going to scale that down to a 37-bed memory care. And they said, we're not going to have an external marketer. You'll handle that, and the same person that's responsible for making sure that the care is delivered will be the one promising that it's going to get delivered. And we'll even pay you more than you were making at that 120-bed facility. And I thought, this is amazing. They're going to pay me more, smaller facility. Well, if you've ever done memory care, I can tell you that 37 beds of memory care is more time-consuming and more difficult than 120 units of traditional assisted living. I had to learn that one really quick. So there I was, ready to go out on Friday of the first week to do some external marketing. And before I went out the door, one of my team members said, so Eric, what are you going to do about the billboard? And I said, the billboard? What are you talking about? And his face turned kind of white, and he said, don't tell me they didn't tell you about the billboard. And it's like the air went out of the room. I went, what are you talking about? Well, let me summarize the experience with the billboard. Before I got back to Boise to take over this building, there was a family of a resident the resident was on hospice, and the family was getting increasingly frustrated with how some things were going. And in the end, although it was expected that that resident would probably be alive for 2 to 3 more months, due to some missteps on the part of the hospice agency and some missteps on the part of the facility staff that I've never been able to fully sort out, this woman ended up dying in a way that was very frustrating to the family. They were not happy at all with how she died. In fact, they were so unhappy that on a very busy street corner where they owned a large parcel of land, they erected a large billboard, and they put a picture of their mom, which they took of her when she was writhing in bed at the end of her life. And they wrote out the name of the building, and they said, such and such did this to our mother. Talk about external forces working against you. How'd you like to market against that? I was so shocked when I found out about this the Friday of my first week in that building. And I didn't go out to do any marketing because I suddenly thought, maybe we don't even deserve to have more residents. And so I just went to work, interviewing people, digging in, trying to figure out what's working, what's not working. How did we get to that point? And I actually didn't go out and do any sort of external outreach for 6 months. But after 12 months, our building was full. The team worked really hard to take good care of our residents so that we could enthusiastically say, yes, we have earned the right to have more residents. Because we sincerely believed that if we earned the right, that they would come. And you know what started happening? The families of our residents started referring their friends. And then their friends started referring other people. And before long, I woke up and realized we had an army of marketers. I wasn't the marketer. Everyone that the organization interacted with was the marketer. And we didn't have a recruiting problem. At that time, the market might be what you'd describe a little bit overbuilt in that area. And it was difficult to get staff. But we didn't have any trouble getting staff, and we retained the staff because they had such a good experience there, and they learned so much, and they were so fired up about what was going on that they told their friends who were other professionals that might want to work in our building. And things turned around, and we often had a waiting list that went as long as 18 people. And in a 37-bed facility, that's kind of a nice cushion to have. We felt like we had learned a lot from that. Now, we didn't solve every problem. There were still things that went wrong. There were still a lot of very difficult days. The key takeaway from that, though, is that when you focus on the internal problems and you really pay a lot of attention to them and you start farming, amazing things happen. And I want those amazing things to be happening for you in your life, in your family, in your organization. So let's dig in just a little bit more. What exactly does farming look like in an organization? Well, there are a lot of things that we could talk about, but today I'm just going to focus on 3 keys. We want to focus on making sure that we're developing teams, not departments. That's the first of these 3 keys. By the way, if any of you want these slides, I think Brittany has them available. And if not, I'll give you my email address at the end. I'll be happy to email you a copy of these slides if any of you want them. Okay, so the first thing that we have to do is focus on teams, not departments. What does that mean? Well, let's talk about what I would call departmentalized thinking. And I have a picture of grain silos here because you've all heard of the idea of silo mentality or silos in our organizations. Silos are when one group is kind of separated from the other group and they don't really communicate, and it creates a whole lot of problems in our organizations. When it comes to departmentalized thinking or kind of a silo mentality, I think it's practically institutionalized in assisted living and skilled nursing. You have the nursing department that's responsible for making sure that people are clean and dry and seasonally appropriate clothing, and we give them their pills on time. And you have dietary that's responsible for making sure they've got 3 square meals and snacks in between, so that there's no chance that they would ever have the very human experience of a little touch of hunger. And we think that meaningful activity, well, that's the activity department's job, isn't it? Well, if you start to unpack this, you realize that this is destructive in a lot of ways. It causes us to point the finger at others when something doesn't go well, and to think that things happen in a fractured way in life. And that's just simply not the case. That's not how things really work. Everyone in healthcare has the same job, in my opinion. If I had my way, we could scrap all the job descriptions for healthcare professionals, and we would just write one job description. So here it is. Your job and mine and that of every other healthcare professional is to create opportunities for the people we serve to continue having a meaningful life. Period. That's it. That's what we do. And we do that by focusing on the whole person. People have spiritual, physical, intellectual, cultural, and emotional kinds of needs. And if we're not paying attention to the whole person and focusing on all of those needs, we're missing something. But for a long time, we've deluded ourselves as a profession into thinking that if you keep someone clean and dry and seasonally appropriate clothing, and you give them their pills on time, and you give them their meals, that you've done something amazing and you deserve 5 gold stars. And if that's all that you and I had to look forward to in the day, that's a pretty bare minimum day, isn't it? Who we are is largely what happens after the ADLs get performed. And yet, why do people move into assisted living and skilled nursing? Usually it's because they can't take care of themselves fully anymore, and most of that means they need help with their activities of daily living. So we've created this situation where the mentality is, oh, success means we check those things off the list. A care plan is one of the greatest tools known to humanity for dehumanizing people. Now, you better follow the care plan. It's important, but we need to understand limitations of care plans. Care plans are just lists of tasks. And if we were to write a care plan for all of us, it would basically say the same thing: independent in ambulation, independent in feeding ourselves, independent in using the bathroom, independent in bathing, and on and on and on. We live independent lives, and so our care plans would look about the same. But you and I are very different people, because who we are is what happens after those ADLs get completed. And if we don't understand that, we don't even understand what we're up against when it comes to trying to create a situation that's really meaningful for the people that we serve and those on our team serving them. If we want to help people have a great human experience, we have to get away from this departmentalized, fractured thinking that focuses so much on ADLs. So, how about an example of that? I want to tell you about Dan, who is a man, you'll see here on the right. He's the guy there standing on the right, the tallest one in the picture. Dan had early onset Alzheimer's disease. He grew up in California. He spent his entire working career in California. He was selling cars for a living. And he was so good at mental math that if you went to buy a car from Dan, you could select the options that you wanted, and he would add them up in his head, calculate the total purchase price with sales tax in his head, and give you the bottom line total, just like that. And it was all mental math. That's like black magic to me. That's just amazing that someone has that capacity. He also built rocket cars in a massive shop with every tool known to man, and he would put them on flatbed trailers, and he'd drag them over here to Utah to the Bonneville Salt Flats, and he would race those rocket cars. He was a pretty cool guy. And then in his late 50s, he developed early onset Alzheimer's disease. And he lost his job, and his wife ultimately needed to find a little bit better paying job, and she found it at Boise State University. So they moved to the Boise area, and Dan was living at home. And as his dementia progressed, his wife started realizing he can't stay home alone anymore. This is getting unsafe. He was still happy. He was gregarious. He could have a good conversation with you. He was very strong, very ambulatory. In so many ways, his body was working extremely well. But when I first met Dan, and I went over to his house to get to know him and do a little bit of a cognitive evaluation, I went out to his shop, and I picked up a crescent wrench. And I grew up with a dad that had grown up on a farm. He could fix anything. And so I grew up around tools. I knew tools as well as anybody. I knew exactly what a crescent wrench was, but I played dumb, and I said, Dan, I forget, what do you call this? And he said, it's a, oh, you know the thing, you put it on the thing and you turn it. Dang it, why can't I remember that? That's about where Dan was in his cognitive functioning. Well, his wife wanted to move him into our building. She had had 3 people refer her, and they had all said, there's nowhere else that I would go except to this community. And so she was adamant, I want to move Dan to your facility. And we had a little bit of a problem. We had no male residents at that time. Most of our residents were over age 85, and they were all women. And if you look at the kinds of things that 85-plus-year-old women like to do, not quite the same as a guy in his early 60s who's physically very capable. And I wasn't convinced that we could give him enough meaningful things to engage in for this to go well. And I was worried that it might not go well at all. And I cared about our reputation. So I sat down with our team and I said, here's the situation. We have an opportunity to bring in this man. He's a really nice guy. I think he'd be a great resident, except I don't know how we're going to keep him engaged. We had a thriving activity department with a woman that had worked there already for 8 years, and she was phenomenal. And I had a lot of confidence in her. But how do you do stuff for this one guy? And Chandra Turner, our maintenance director, who also was a licensed med tech and had a heart of gold, kind of leaned forward in her chair and she said, Eric, don't even worry about it. I got it covered. And I had worked with Chandra long enough to trust her. And I said, great. And so the next week, we moved Dan in. And every time Chandra was shampooing carpet, guess who was holding the cord to make sure that nobody tripped? Every time Chandra moved chairs or tables, guess who was assisting? Every time she had to go out and do something like shovel landscaping rock, guess who was helping and walking in the lobby and wiping the sweat from his forehead, saying, wow, we're working really hard, boss. Guess who got a name tag because he thought that he worked there? One day I was showing a prospective resident's family around the building, and we walked around the corner into a common area, and the common area had ceilings that were almost this high. And there's Dan off in the corner with a long-handled pole and a cloth on the end of it, and he's getting cobwebs out of the corner. And Chandra was standing next to him, assisting, kind of guiding him, supervising, if you will. And as we walked around the corner, the family of this prospective resident, who happened to be a man, looked at Dan and said, oh, is that your maintenance man? And I said, no, actually, he lives here, but he really likes to help. Our maintenance director is that woman standing right next to him. She's guiding him. And all of a sudden, I hear this conversation between husband and wife. Oh my gosh, Dad would love this. Can you believe that any place does that? Oh, we should move Dad in. Well, fast forward a year and a half later, and 52% of our residents were men. You lose about half your residents every year in memory care just because Alzheimer's runs its course and people tend to die. And as people were moving in, the word got out, oh my gosh, they do innovative things for men. We've got to move Dad there. And it was all because of Chandra. My favorite Chandra and Dan story was the day that she had to get on the roof and service the HVAC equipment. And no, he didn't get on the roof. Some of you had this look like, whoa, don't tell me you did that. Dan did not go on the roof. Chandra needed a reason to keep him on the ground. And she did one of the most brilliant things that I've ever seen. She played the damsel in distress card with him and said, Dan, I just don't know what I'm going to do. What is it? Now, it helped that Chandra was about 35 years old. She was pretty attractive, and Dan would kind of eat out of the palm of her hand. She said, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know how I'm going to get it all done. I'm supposed to get on the roof and take care of the HVAC equipment. And I'm supposed to also be painting the handrails in the building. Could you possibly help me? I've got to re-lacquer these handrails. And he said, well, what do I have to do? And she had an empty lacquer can filled with water. She knew that his sense of smell was absolutely gone, so he couldn't smell that wasn't lacquer. She gave him a clean paintbrush, and he painted water on the handrails of the building for 2 hours. And all the staff would pass by and pat him on the back and say, you're such a good guy to have around. What would we do without you? Meanwhile, she got a lot of other stuff done. And Dan got to feel amazing about himself because he was useful again. He was important. He was needed. And all of us have a human need to be needed. I loved seeing that happen. I marveled at the innovation that Chandra had and her insight and her creativity. And I want to point out one of the most important facts about this story, that Chandra was not the activity director. Keeping Dan engaged in all these things that were meaningful had nothing to do with what department Chandra worked in. And in some of our buildings, people say, we just don't have enough activity staff to keep people engaged. Well, if we take a step back and we realize maybe it's not an asset problem, maybe it's an allocation problem, we start to see some solutions. If we recognize that it's everybody's job to create opportunities for the people we serve to continue having a meaningful life, then we can get outside this narrow departmentalized box and start thinking and saying, oh wow, all of us have some responsibility here, and things can flow a little differently once we learn to see those things. It's very helpful to us. So, be aware that if you get caught in departmentalized thinking, that it's going to destroy joy and innovation and teamwork and everything that could make a community great. Now, let's go back to the research a little bit. Because I told you that the ADP Research Institute in 2018 found that 84% of workers in all sorts of countries, almost 20,000 people surveyed, were just unengaged. That's not a great number. But their research dug deeper and can teach us some important things. So, those who felt like they were part of a team were a lot more engaged. So, what causes a person to feel like they're part of a team? Well, it's not the org chart, I can tell you that. I once consulted at a critical access hospital and co-located skilled nursing facility in southeast Idaho. And every month I would go for about 2 days and work in this facility and train the staff and do observations and do some executive coaching with their CEO. And every month for 3 months, the CEO would proudly display his new org chart. And he had shifted all these seats on the bus. He was spending his time trying to figure out where to move people in the organization and what to call their position. And I finally thought, oh my gosh, this is not going well. If he thinks that all he has to do to fix his organization is shift the seats around on the bus, then we're in real trouble. One of the things that he needed to recognize is that the org chart, it's helpful to have a rough idea of structure, but it's never really about how work actually gets done. If someone is designated as your supervisor, and you go to your supervisor and you have a question or you have a need for some assistance, and the supervisor won't give you the time of day, most people go find somebody else in the organization that will help them get done the thing that they need to get done. And it might just be that the supervisor's busy with something else and can't help right then, and if that's not good enough for the person asking, they'll find someone who can help them sooner. And if they do that again and again, pretty soon a new pattern develops. Our organizations develop patterns of behavior by first forming. They come together, you put a bunch of people together, and then there's a storming process where there's some disconnects and things that might not go well or things that might not happen according to plan. And then you develop organizational norms. People get used to things happening in a particular way. And then the organization performs. So forming, storming, norming, performing. Those are the 4 ways that a group comes together and starts doing what it does. And the org chart doesn't help us with that. It tells us how we might like to form things, but that's not where the norms really develop in most cases. So the org chart's not going to help us. What will? Well, trust for the leader. And of those who trusted their leader, 45% were fully engaged. That's a lot better metric than 84% disengaged. And it begs the question, well, what causes people to trust their leader? How do you develop greater trust in the leader? Well, there are 2 things that the ADP Research Institute found that stood out more than anything else. Number 1 is, do I clearly know what is expected of me at work? If people aren't clear on what they're supposed to be doing and what success looks like and how it gets measured, then there's a sense of uncertainty. And when they feel uncertainty, guess who they blame? Whoever the leader is. So if you want people to trust the leader, they need to be really clear about what it is that they're supposed to be doing. And the second thing the ADP Research Institute found is that people need to use their strengths every day. Well, that's an interesting thing to consider. We should dig into that a little bit more. So how do we focus on strengths, and why is it so important? I want you to think about some of the employee reviews that you've conducted or participated in over the years. I would bet that for most of us, the majority of employee reviews that we've had, if we've had them consistently, and not all organizations are even great about that, but if we've had employee reviews, usually we spend about 90% of the time talking about goals for next year, things that we need to work on, all the stuff that has to get fixed. and maybe 10% of the time talking about what has gone well. If we think about it, this is also sort of human nature in everyday life. If your kid comes home from school with a report card and it says reading, A, social studies, A, English, A, math, C-, guess where the attention goes for the majority of parents all over the world? Well, it goes right to the C-, doesn't it? We have this idea that people need to be really good at everything, that people should get an A in everything. And it's actually contrary to what you see amongst very successful people. When is the last time you watched an Olympic figure skater and found yourself in that second conversation in the mind, you know, the one that we're supposed to be trying to actively control as we focus in on something? When is the last time you watched an Olympic figure skater and you found yourself thinking, I wonder how she scored in math? Nobody thinks that. But you don't become world class at something without being really imbalanced. You don't become a world class figure skater or business leader or anything if you don't give up a whole bunch of other stuff. Now, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have basic math skills and have a level of competency. We all need that. We should be able to make change. We should be able to calculate a tip and stuff that you just need to be a successful human being. But it doesn't matter if your goal is to be an Olympic figure skater, it's not going to help you to ace calculus. And yet sometimes we act as if people should be phenomenal at everything. And so we have this unnatural attraction toward where people are deficient and trying to fix the deficiencies. That's not motivating for anybody. I'm going to show you some video of a young Lionel Messi. And some of you watched enough World Cup soccer recently that you know who Lionel Messi is. Probably the greatest soccer player that's ever lived. And I suppose people can debate that, but he is amazing. This was Lionel Messi as a child. I want you to just watch what the recruiters would have seen. There are actually two major things that would have stood out if recruiters were watching Lionel Messi play. Here we go. And there's no sound, so we're not missing anything here. All right, so what kinds of things did you see? Go ahead and just call it out. What did you... Oh, okay. Now, I have a sneaking suspicion that you already knew that about Lionel Messi. Yeah, Lionel Messi, as a child, was kicking about 10 times with his left foot for every one that he'd kick with his right foot. And the problem with that is that if people get to know that, then they can box you in and they can exploit that weakness. The perfect soccer player, we would think, would be very capable with both the left foot and the right foot. And so those who were recruiting looked at Lionel Messi and all the goals that he was scoring and thinking, wow, this kid is amazing, but he's very left foot dominant. And so we might want to do something about that left foot dominance because we don't know if he'll make it in the pros if he's got a problem like that. There's one other thing. What about his teammates? He celebrated with his teammates, so that was a great thing. What else? He didn't pass to his teammates. Okay, but let's face it, if you've ever played Little League anything, if you've got a superstar on the team and you want to win, you give him the ball every last time, and you don't even care about it, because I just want to win. That's just human nature. So what else? Awesome, totally focused on the ball. Yeah, you're hitting on a lot of good things that Lionel Messi was doing. There's one other thing that stood out. He was smaller. Yeah, he had a growth hormone deficiency, and his parents couldn't afford to give him growth hormone. It was about $400 a month in US dollars back in the day, and they couldn't afford that. So he was really short. And so the recruiters said, "You're short and you're left foot dominant." And so FC Barcelona moved him and his family to Spain when he was about 13 years old, and they paid big bucks for him to have the very best coaching on the planet to overcome that left foot dominance and to give him growth hormone treatment so that he could have any hope of being a little bit taller and overcome that problem. And after a couple of years, Messi said, "I'm done, I'm miserable, I want to go home." Because he was having no fun playing soccer. It wasn't enjoyable anymore because every day, all he did, day in, day out, was work on his weaknesses. His coaches were constantly pointing out the problem with his left foot dominance. And it was so deflating, he was ready to quit. Thankfully, his coaches got the hint and they said, "Okay, we're going to quit bugging you about that left foot dominance. Just make sure wherever you are, you're dangerous. Make sure that even if the entire world knows that you're really left foot dominant, that they can't do anything about it because you're so fast with that left foot that you're past them before they've even figured out what's happened. And we're just going to accept that you're short. It hasn't stopped you to this point." So now here is some footage from the 2015 Copa del Rey, and you're going to watch Lionel Messi just blast past practically the entire other team. So watch down at the base of the screen. There's Messi. I know it's kind of hard to see from the back. Isn't that amazing? That's what it looks like when you get out of somebody's way and you let them do what they're really good at doing, where they're naturally motivated. So the question is, what's your left foot? And what is the left foot of the people on your team? What are they really, really good at? We need to spend more like 90% of our time trying to figure out where people are thriving, trying to figure out what motivates them, trying to understand what fires them up naturally in the workplace. We all have some things on the job that we dislike, and we all have some things that totally fill us up and have us 100% motivated and all in. I have members of my own team that are so interested in certain topics that they will study it and buy books about it and dig in deep, and I don't even say anything about it. I don't have to ask them to go do that. They do it because they want to, because they're naturally interested in those topics. If we can pay really close attention to where our teams are thriving, where our team members are loving their job, that will tell us something about where they need to spend a lot more of their time. And if someone is excited and engaged in getting to use their strengths, everything works better. And if you're not in love with your job, then pay attention to when you are in love with the thing that you're doing. What gets you out of bed in the morning? What's exciting for you? What do you naturally want to learn more about? When you have a free moment and you get to go check in on something and learn something more, what is it that you want to learn about? If you can pay attention to those things, that's going to tell you where your superpowers are. And you will accomplish a lot more amazing things in this world by leveraging your superpowers than just trying to work on your weaknesses all day long. Whoops. So one of the things that we can do to help people identify and work on their strengths is to improve the educational level of the team. I think the reason that that's so important is illustrated by this guy. Does anybody know who this man is? I know the picture might be a little bit hard to see in the back. Do you know who this is? This is Howard Schultz. Howard Schultz was the guy that took over a small Seattle coffee company and turned it into Starbucks, the worldwide behemoth that it is. And he did that not by building a global coffee company. He did that by building a people company. And he's been very clear about it. He has known consciously that this is what he was doing. He said, we want Starbucks to be the number 3 place that you choose to be. Some of you might be thinking, number 3, like, why not number 1? Well, the number 1 place that most people choose to spend their time is in their own home. The second place where people choose to spend their time is at their job. Howard Schultz wanted number 3 to be a Starbucks. And you don't do that just by serving coffee. You have to produce an amazing human experience. And so when he took over Starbucks, he started providing so much training for baristas that you could even get college credit for some of what they were studying. He found that he needed to give about 72 hours of direct training to a barista in year 1 so that they could learn how to create a human interaction that was so effective that people would come back and pay $5 for a cup of coffee when they could get it for cents down the street at McDonald's. Now, if it takes 72 hours in year 1 alone to train a barista how to pour a $5 cup of coffee, then where is the threshold for training a CNA to go into the room of someone who doesn't even recognize who they are and to build a relationship of trust such that that person will allow them to assist them to get dressed or to get into the shower or to use the toilet? I have no idea where that bar is, but I know it's a lot harder than being a barista and pouring a $5 cup of coffee. And I'm not trying to downplay the significance of that job out in the workforce. It's just infinitely more complicated to assist people with those really sensitive needs. And I doubt anyone in the room does 72 hours of training in year 1 alone with the frontline staff. We can't possibly educate our people enough. It needs to happen on a daily basis. And when it does, when people are learning and growing, they get further. One of the things that I discovered when I took over that struggling memory care community is that a lot of the frontline staff just didn't know how to interact very effectively. And I had been studying dementia for years and trying all sorts of different tools and techniques and strategies. And I thought, it's my responsibility to help the team learn how to do these things and to learn from them as well in the process. We all need to help each other. And so we started a practice. Every day at shift change, I or our director of nursing would gather with the team and we would teach one principle, one idea, one strategy, one caregiving technique, one thing that we had learned from a prior shift with another resident that had worked. And we would say, today we're going to focus on this one thing. And then we're going to come back at the next shift change and talk about what we learned by doing that. And we're going to work together to figure out what's actually making a difference for our residents. It only takes 5 minutes, but if you do that consistently, for the employee that works 40 hours a week, it's about 22 hours a year if you spend about 5 minutes a day. Now, that's not 72 hours, but it creates a culture of thinking and learning and problem solving that's powerful. And some of you might be thinking, well, how do I have time to come up with an idea every day? Or maybe I don't know as much about some of that. I'm new. One of my goals when I started A Mind for All Seasons was to create a tool that people could use and just put it out there and make it free for everyone. And the pandemic is one of those things that gave me the time to actually create the Caregiver Minute, which, if you're not familiar with, is a daily 3 to 7 minute video. It's completely free. There are thousands of people all over the country that watch this and a lot of facilities that use it at their shift change. And it just teaches one idea about caregiving technique or strategy or how you take care of yourself or something about the latest scientific research into brain health related issues. If that's of interest to you, first name and an email address. And it's totally available. There's no advertising. There's no catch. It was a goal that I had a long time ago to share that with the world. Now, In all of this, we've got to be able to avoid burnout. And I love the definition of burnout that actually came from where the term was coined. Dr. Herbert Freudenberger, back in the 1970s, wrote a book called Burnout, The High Cost of High Achievement. And he talks about burnout being the extinguishing of motivation. That's a strong word. It's extinguished. And it is especially true when someone's devotion to a cause doesn't produce the desired results. Well, think about what we've been through the last few years. People show up, they give their blood, sweat, and tears, and residents are still dying right and left in the early stages of the pandemic. That's painful. That's devotion to a cause, and it's not paying off with the desired results. In a lot of facilities, you put up the isolation area, the plastic goes up, you tape everything off. You work really, really hard, the plastic comes down, you feel like, hey, now we're getting somewhere. A few months go by, the vaccines didn't solve everything like we hoped that they would. The plastic sheeting goes back up, we're right back where we started. That's a recipe for burnout, and we're seeing it. I've given you a list on this slide of many reasons, especially the top reasons why people experience burnout. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them. We had a little bit of a slow start this morning. You can read the slides, you can look at that, you can have that. But I think it's important to be aware of the kinds of things that cause burnout. And we need to realize that it's a lot easier to prepare and prevent than it is to repair and repent. Some of us are so busy out hunting that we're not farming with the team. We're not taking care of the plant, so to speak, making sure that it's healthy and growing well. We're waiting till the plant is withering and dying, till the employee is ready to leave the organization, and they come to us with our notice, and then we do a lot of heroic measures to try to keep them and salvage the relationship. It would have been a lot easier to keep the plant healthy in the first place. It's just not as sexy as hunting. And until we recognize that, we're going to repeat the cycle of letting the plants wither and then wondering why we have such a problem. Okay, the last key that we need to focus on is to build a movement, not an organization. Don't think about what you do as just another skilled nursing facility or another assisted living facility. Create a movement, because people will get behind movements. When it comes to influencing the people around us, there's basically two possibilities. You can either be a shepherd or you can be a sheep herder. Sheep herders drive from behind. They use dogs and sticks to try to cajole others, to try to cajole the sheep into falling in line and going the direction they want them to go. It's very easy to focus on being a ruler in the workplace and having threats if people don't do what they're supposed to do. It's also easy to focus on being a manager and just having a transactional relationship. Hey, if you do this, you'll get that. That's a transactional relationship. That's managing people. The only way, I think, to really lead is to be out in front, like the shepherd that the sheep willingly follow because they love the shepherd. We need to nurture the relationships with our teams, and we need to be out in front leading. Professor Hugh Nibley once said, true leaders are inspiring because they are inspired. So if your team is not falling in line, if they're not following, maybe it's because you're not leading. And maybe it's time to get more inspired in what you're doing, to be so fired up about a cause that people can't help but be excited about it, if it's the kind of cause that they're interested in. So every mass movement has three things. You've got a leader who exudes confidence, you've got a clear vision of where the group is going, and there has to be a new opportunity. All great leaders paint the picture that tomorrow's going to be a brighter day. If you read everything ever written about leadership, it actually comes down to that one thing. Real leaders are fired up about tomorrow being a brighter day. They don't have all the answers as to how to get there, but they paint a really clear picture of why tomorrow's going to be amazing. And people choose to fall in line. They're like Martin Luther King Jr., who didn't give the I have a plan speech. He gave the I have a dream speech. That's what leadership sounds like. We can take a lesson from Patch Adams. Maybe you've seen the movie with Robin Williams from many years ago. Well, the real-life Patch Adams, Dr. Patch Adams, is far more flamboyant than the movie character. The real Patch Adams has had a dream for a long, long time, many years, of having a hospital that runs very differently, a hospital that really treats the whole person, where there's a lot of humanity infused into everything. And did you know that people, healthcare professionals, will willingly spend their vacation time and go at their own expense to work at the hospital that Dr. Patch Adams has developed? They voluntarily go give of their time. Some of us think, wow, we just can't pay our people enough. We don't have enough money in the budget to attract CNAs because down the street they're paying $1.50 an hour more. And you know what? The car wash down the street from where my office is in Boise, Idaho, will hire high school kids and pay them $18 an hour. And the skilled nursing facilities are going, it takes an act of Congress to raise the reimbursement rates, literally, and we can't afford to pay some of our staff $18 an hour. Washing bodies is a lot harder than washing cars. How on earth are we going to compete? I think it's time that we take a step back and realize that there are some people in the healthcare world that will actually go at their own expense for the privilege of learning from someone who's so inspiring to them that they say, I want to be a part of that, and I'll even pay to do it. And if you think that that's an isolated case, several years ago, I had a speech therapist come to me who I've known for years. She's been to lots of workshops that I've done, and she saw the work that we were doing in helping people with brain health problems, and she said, oh my goodness, Eric, when I work with people that have Alzheimer's disease, I can maybe improve their Montreal Cognitive Assessment scores by 2 points in 6 months of effort. But I'm regularly watching you and your team add 5 to 10 points on a 30-point test in 4 to 6 months. I want to know how you guys are doing that because it's making people more functional. And I said, I'd love to hire you. I can't afford you. And she said, well, my husband just started a new job. He's making a lot more money than he was. I could actually afford to work for free for a while. Would you take me on as an unpaid apprentice? And I said, sure. We worked out an apprenticeship agreement. And within 3 months, she had helped us grow enough and had generated enough new revenue that I could actually afford to hire her. People will work for free sometimes if there's an exciting enough opportunity. So, what if we could do more with fewer staff? As we're considering the workforce problem that we're facing, I think we need to consider that. Because there's a revenue side of the equation, there's an expense side of the equation. And a lot of you deal with the finances enough to know that if you're just trying to get more revenue coming in and you're not paying attention to the expenses, you're in trouble. When it comes to staffing, I think we're having that kind of a problem. Think of revenue and staffing as new staff coming in. People want more revenue. They want more staff coming in. But the single greatest expense when it comes to staffing, the thing that determines how many staff we need, is resident acuity. If we could spend time doing innovative things to help our residents actually function better, then we wouldn't need as many staff. That's paying attention to the expense side of the equation. So let me tell you about someone who did that. A little case study here. So as background to the case study, I'll just say, if you think about the aging trajectory, most people think about life as like a hill. And you spend the first half of your life going up the hill, and then at some point, you go down the hill. And I don't know exactly where that point is, but at some magical moment, you go to the doctor's office, and you have certain complaints about things. And instead of treating you like you're 20 and saying, oh my gosh, we got to run this test and that test, we got to figure this out, there's a problem. The doctor looks at you kind of sideways and says, well, you are getting older. And that feels like a slap across the face. At some magical moment, we expect that the wheels are just going to come off the bus. And things are going to have some sort of a glide slope to the finish line. Now, some people coast down into their mid to late 90s, maybe even their centenarians, and they touch down on the runway of life, and it's a pretty smooth ride. For other people, it's steeper. For other people, it's like the engine's on fire, their brain's falling apart, they are headed to the ground, and you and I are just running around passing out milk and cookies like flight attendants, keeping everybody comfortable, even though everyone knows this ship is going down, and it's going down fast. A lot of people have been trying to come up with drugs to cure Alzheimer's disease. A researcher at UCLA, Dr. Dale Bredesen, several years ago said, well, based on his research, the perfect drug would have to do this much stuff. Does that help you understand why there's not a drug to cure Alzheimer's disease? You can't make one drug that would do 50 different things. But he did take a different approach. He tried some things several years ago where he said, well, it's like you got a bunch of holes in the roof. What if we measured as many of those holes as we could and we patched them? In other words, let's use a different approach. Well, that approach has caught on. There are actually a lot of researchers that use a multimodal approach. The research that we do at A Mind for All Seasons is largely based on that idea that if you stack a whole lot of interventions in someone's favor, they're going to do better. So when someone says you can't do anything for Alzheimer's, I like to show them this slide. There's a lot of stuff you can do. So meet Tyson, who came to my office a few years ago. And Tyson decided, I'm seeing a lot of equipment here that improves blood flow, it calms inflammation, it gets 30% more oxygen to the brain in some cases, can retrain the brain in significant ways. It's like you got a gym for the brain here, Eric. I think if I put that in my assisted living facilities, I would stand out in the sea of sameness. I would be different. So he did. In his facilities in North Idaho and in Washington and Oregon, Guardian Angel Homes, he put a whole bunch of equipment. And now they take people from a significant fall risk to doing much better within a couple of months of effort. Here's a lady that was 105 years old. She went from the 26th percentile to the 51st percentile in terms of fall risk. Let's look at this lady who was 100 years old. She was a Hoyer lift transfer for 10 years. Look at her now. After 3 months of using some of the medical devices that he was using, she now walks 75 feet with a walker and a one-person assist. In other words, he improved his staff ratio 100%. It only takes one person to assist this woman now. That's paying attention to the expense side of the equation. And when you do innovative things, it pays off big time. Tyson recently told me that he had a couple of veteran CNAs, 20 years of experience they each had, who uprooted their families, convinced their husbands to get job transfers, and they moved from the state of Georgia to Richland, Washington, to one of Tyson's facilities there for the privilege of working in that facility because they were sick and tired of just straightening deck chairs on the Titanic. They wanted to do something amazing and help people function just a little bit better. That was more rewarding to them. What if your staffing problem could be solved by recruiting people from clear on the other side of the country because what you're doing is so innovative that they're attracted to that? Well, we've only scratched the surface, but I hope that it's given you some things to think about. I hope that you will help figure out for your organization what the brighter tomorrow is going to look like and what you need to do to farm consistently and to make such a difference that people will choose to live in your community and work in your community, regardless of whatever else is going on in the world around you. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.